In 1953, the CIA initiated one of the darkest and most disturbing programs in American history. Its codename, MK-Ultra. Its objective, to control the human mind. For more than 20 years, government scientists administered LSD and other drugs to innocent citizens without their knowledge or consent. Prostitutes drugged clients in secret brothels. Prisoners were tortured with massive doses. Psychiatric patients became guinea pigs, all funded with millions of dollars of public money. But the most terrifying part was not what they did. It was what they lost. Thousands of documents destroyed, victims silenced forever, and a legacy that changed American counterculture in ways the CIA never imagined. This is the true story of how the government created a monster it could not control. The year was 1945. World War II had just ended, but a new conflict was already beginning. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies against fascism, now faced each other across an ideological chasm that split the entire world. This was the Cold War, and it was unlike any war humanity had ever seen. There were no traditional battlefields, no clear front lines. Instead, this was a war of shadows, espionage, and psychological warfare. And American intelligence agencies were terrified of a weapon they believed the communists had perfected: brainwashing. During the Korean War, American prisoners of war began making shocking confessions. Captured soldiers appeared on camera admitting to war crimes they had never committed. They denounced their own country. They praised communism. When these men returned home, they told stories of something called thought reform, mysterious techniques that could supposedly erase a person's beliefs and replace them with new ones. Was it real, or was it propaganda? The CIA did not know, and that uncertainty kept them awake at night. In the halls of power in Washington, D.C., paranoia took root. If the Soviets or the Chinese had discovered how to control human minds, America needed that power too, or they would lose the Cold War before it truly began. Intelligence officials convinced themselves they were facing an existential threat. The enemy could turn American soldiers into sleeper agents. They could extract secrets from captured spies. They could undermine democracy itself by programming citizens to do their bidding. In this climate of fear, moral boundaries began to dissolve. The question was no longer whether mind control research was ethical. The question was, could America afford not to pursue it? The answer, they decided, was no, and that decision would lead to 2 decades of unspeakable horror. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles authorized a program that would become one of the most infamous operations in American intelligence history. Its name was Project MK-Ultra. The MK designation stood for experiments conducted by the technical services staff. Ultra was a reference to the top secret classification level. The budget was staggering, $25 million, equivalent to roughly $250 million today. This was not a small experimental project. This was an institutional commitment to cracking the code of human consciousness itself. To lead this endeavor, the CIA chose Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a biochemist with a clubfoot and a stutter who raised goats on his farm in Virginia. Gottlieb was a folk dancer, a student of poetry, and by all accounts a devoted family man. He was also about to become the architect of systematic human rights abuses that would span 2 decades and destroy countless lives. The stated objective of MK-Ultra was simple and terrifying: to develop techniques for controlling human behavior. The CIA wanted to create methods for extracting information from unwilling subjects. They wanted to find ways to make enemy spies confess. They wanted, in essence, to learn how to erase a person's free will and replace it with programmed obedience. But the scope of MK-Ultra went far beyond what most people imagine. This was not just one laboratory with a few rogue scientists. MKUltra eventually encompassed 149 separate sub-projects conducted at more than 80 institutions across the United States and Canada. Major universities participated. Prestigious hospitals took part. Federal prisons became testing grounds. Professors at Harvard, Stanford, and Columbia received grants without knowing they came from the CIA. Hospital patients agreed to experimental treatments without being told they were part of intelligence research. Prison inmates were offered reduced sentences or drugs in exchange for participation in studies whose true purpose they never understood. The program operated in complete secrecy. There was no oversight from Congress, no independent ethical review. The scientists working on MKUltra answered to no one except the intelligence community itself. And the intelligence community had decided that national security justified almost anything. They experimented with hypnosis. They studied sensory deprivation. They tested truth serums ranging from barbiturates to plant extracts. They explored electroshock therapy pushed to extremes. They investigated techniques to induce amnesia. They even researched poisons disguised as everyday objects, like a tube of toothpaste that could cause a heart attack. But of all the methods they explored, one substance captured their imagination more than any other. A compound so powerful that a single dose measured in millionths of a gram could completely alter human consciousness. That substance was lysergic acid diethylamide. LSD had been discovered by accident in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann while he was working for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals. He was trying to develop a respiratory and circulatory stimulant when he accidentally absorbed a small amount of the compound through his skin. What happened next changed the history of pharmacology. Hofmann experienced what he later called a remarkable restlessness combined with a slight dizziness. He went home and lay down, entering a dreamlike state filled with intense, kaleidoscopic visions. Colors became alive. Shapes morphed and breathed. Time itself seemed to stretch and compress. When the effects wore off several hours later, Hofmann was convinced he had stumbled upon something extraordinary. The psychiatric community initially showed interest in LSD as a potential tool for studying schizophrenia and treating various mental illnesses. But when the CIA learned about this substance, they saw something else entirely: the perfect weapon for psychological warfare. LSD was colorless, odorless, and tasteless. It could be slipped into food or drinks without detection. It was extraordinarily potent, meaning small quantities could affect many people. And most importantly, it completely disrupted normal consciousness, making subjects confused, suggestible, and vulnerable. To the minds at MKUltra, LSD was not just a drug. It was the key to unlocking total mind control. In 1953, the CIA began purchasing LSD in bulk from Sandoz. They bought so much of it, in fact, that for years they were the primary customer for the world's entire supply. Scientists at Fort Detrick in Maryland, working undercover as employees of a fake organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, began testing LSD on whoever they could find. They dosed each other in the office to observe the effects. They gave it to military volunteers, though the volunteers were never told what drug they were actually receiving. They administered it to mental patients in hospitals. They tested it on prisoners. And in at least one case, they gave it to one of their own with devastating consequences. Dr. Frank Olson was a biochemist working for the Army's Special Operations Division. Collaborating closely with the CIA, in November of 1953 during a retreat at a Maryland cabin, Sidney Gottlieb spiked Olson's after-dinner drink with LSD without telling him. Olson had a terrible reaction. He became paranoid, depressed, and increasingly agitated over the following days. On November 28th, just 9 days after being dosed, Frank Olson plunged to his death from the 13th floor window of the Statler Hotel in New York City. The official report called it suicide. His family believed otherwise. They believed Frank Olson had been murdered because he knew too much about MKUltra and had expressed moral concerns about the program. The truth of what happened that night remains disputed to this day. But one thing is certain, Frank Olson was the first confirmed casualty of MK Ultra. He would not be the last. If the death of Frank Olson represented MK Ultra's capacity for tragedy, what came next demonstrated its capacity for depravity. The CIA decided that laboratory testing was insufficient. They needed to observe the effects of LSD on unsuspecting subjects in real-world environments. So they created something that sounds too bizarre to be true, yet the historical record proves it absolutely was. Government-operated brothels where prostitutes secretly drugged clients, while CIA agents watched from behind one-way mirrors. The operation was called Midnight Climax, and it operated primarily in San Francisco and New York City throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. The CIA rented apartments in both cities and decorated them to look like brothels, complete with red lights, pornographic posters, and well-stocked bars. They installed two-way mirrors, microphones, and cameras to record everything that happened. Then they recruited prostitutes to work for the government. These women, who were often facing legal trouble themselves, were paid to bring men back to these apartments, serve them drinks laced with LSD, and then engage them in activities while CIA agents observed and took notes. The agent in charge was a former narcotics officer named George Hunter White, who had already built a reputation for ruthless interrogation techniques. White loved his assignment. He would sit in the observation room, mixing himself martinis, watching through the mirror as unsuspecting men's minds unraveled under the influence of powerful hallucinogens. In letters to his superiors, he described the work with enthusiasm, writing about the thrill of watching subjects become confused, paranoid, and vulnerable. The victims of Operation Midnight Climax had no idea what was happening to them. They thought they were having consensual encounters with prostitutes. Instead, they became unwitting test subjects in illegal government experiments. Some were married men who had stopped at a bar. Some were businessmen traveling for work. Some were government employees or military personnel. The CIA did not discriminate when selecting victims. Anyone who walked through those doors could become a test subject. The stated purpose was to study whether LSD could be used during interrogations or to compromise foreign officials through blackmail. The actual effect was to traumatize dozens, possibly hundreds, of American citizens who had no legal recourse and could not even understand what had been done to them. And the research value? Minimal at best. The chaotic environment, the sexual activity, the alcohol, the stress of the situation, all these variables made it impossible to draw meaningful scientific conclusions about LSD's effects. But the operation continued for nearly a decade anyway, not because it was producing useful intelligence, but because no one in authority had the moral courage to shut it down. Operation Midnight Climax finally ended in 1965. Not because of ethical concerns, but because the CIA worried about potential legal exposure. The evidence was buried, the victims were never told, and the prostitutes who had served their country in this bizarre capacity simply disappeared back into their previous lives, carrying secrets they could never share. While Operation Midnight Climax represents MK Ultra at its most bizarre, what happened at the Federal Medical Center in Lexington, Kentucky represents the program at its most systematically cruel. Here, addiction was weaponized, vulnerability was exploited, and human beings were reduced to laboratory equipment. The Lexington facility was officially a prison hospital for treating drug addicts. In reality, it became one of MK Ultra's most productive research sites, and its test subjects were among the most powerless people in America, incarcerated drug addicts, predominantly African-American men, who had no advocates, no resources, and no way to refuse participation. The lead researcher was Dr. Harris Isbell, a specialist in addiction who saw in these prisoners an opportunity for research that would be impossible anywhere else. He could control their environment completely. He could monitor them 24 hours a day. And most importantly, he could incentivize their participation by offering them the one thing they desperately craved: drugs. Isbell made a deal with his test subjects: participate in the LSD experiments, and in return, they would receive morphine, heroin, or other narcotics. For men suffering through the agony of addiction and withdrawal, this was an offer few could refuse, but they had no idea what they were agreeing to. The experiments at Lexington pushed far beyond anything that could be justified as medical research. Isbell gave prisoners LSD every single day for weeks or even months at a time. One documented case involved a subject receiving LSD for 75 consecutive days. 75 days. The doses were massive, often 10 times higher than what would later become known as a typical recreational dose. The effects were devastating. Subjects experienced prolonged psychotic episodes. They suffered lasting personality changes. Some developed severe anxiety disorders that persisted long after the experiments ended. Others experienced flashbacks for years afterward, sudden terrifying returns to the hallucinogenic state without warning, and the research questions Isbell was pursuing. He wanted to know if prolonged LSD use could break down psychological resistance. Could it make subjects more compliant? Could it erase memories? Could it fundamentally alter personality? The answer to all these questions turned out to be yes. LSD administered in this brutal fashion could indeed damage the human psyche. But at what cost? The racial dimension of the Lexington experiments cannot be ignored. The vast majority of subjects were African American prisoners, men from marginalized communities who the researchers clearly viewed as expendable. This was systemic racism dressed up as science, exploitation justified by Cold War necessity. When the experiments finally ended, the prisoners returned to their cells or were released back into society, carrying psychological scars they could barely understand. No one told them they had been part of a CIA program. No one offered them treatment for the trauma they had endured. No one even thanked them for their service to national security. They were simply discarded, their suffering filed away in classified reports that would not see daylight for decades. While prisons and brothels represent the obviously unethical edge of MK Ultra, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the program was how it infiltrated respected institutions. Universities, hospitals, and research centers became accomplices in human rights abuses, often without the knowledge of most people working there. At McGill University in Montreal, Canada, CIA funding supported the work of Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, a psychiatrist who would become one of the most controversial figures in the history of his profession. Cameron was a respected academic, a former president of the American Psychiatric Association. He was also a man who believed he could erase mental illness by destroying existing personality patterns and rebuilding patients from scratch. Cameron's technique, which he called psychic driving, combined everything terrible about mid-century psychiatry into one brutal package. He would place patients into drug-induced comas lasting weeks. While unconscious, they received massive electroshock treatments far beyond standard therapeutic levels. When they woke, they were subjected to hours of recorded messages played on endless loops designed to break down their sense of self. And throughout the process, they received LSD and other hallucinogens. The patients at the Allen Memorial Institute were not prisoners or volunteers. They were people seeking help for depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues. They checked into the hospital hoping to get better. Instead, many left with their memories erased, their personalities shattered, unable to recognize their own families. One victim, a woman named Linda McDonald, entered the hospital suffering from postpartum depression. After Cameron's treatment, she had lost all memory of her life. She could not remember her husband. She did not recognize her children. She had to relearn how to use a toilet, how to eat with utensils, how to do basic tasks. Cameron had not cured her depression. He had erased her entire existence. Meanwhile, at Harvard University, a young psychologist named Timothy Leary was conducting experiments with psilocybin and later LSD on graduate students and volunteers. Leary believed psychedelics could revolutionize psychology and unlock human potential. He had no idea that some of his research funding was coming from CIA front organizations, where one of the students who participated in these Harvard experiments in the early 1960s was a brilliant but troubled young mathematician named Theodore Kaczynski. Years later, Kaczynski would become known as the Unabomber, a domestic terrorist who killed 3 people and injured 23 others with mail bombs. Some researchers have theorized that his participation in brutal psychological experiments at Harvard, including some that may have been funded through MKUltra channels, contributed to his later radicalization. This is not to excuse Kaczynski's terrible crimes, but it does raise disturbing questions about the long-term consequences of MKUltra. How many lives were damaged? How many psychological time bombs were created? How many people suffered consequences years after the experiments ended? The truth is, we will never know because most of the records were destroyed. Behind every document, every experiment number, every clinical observation in the MKUltra files, there was a real human being. A person with a name, a family, dreams and fears, and a life that was forever altered by what was done to them. To understand the true cost of this program, we need to hear some of their stories. Harold Blauer was a professional tennis player in his early 40s who checked into the New York Psychiatric Institute in 1952, suffering from depression following his divorce. Doctors there were secretly conducting MKUltra experiments with mescaline, a powerful hallucinogen. On January 8, 1953, Blauer was injected with a massive dose of mescaline derivative. Within hours, he began convulsing. He died that afternoon. His family was told he had died of natural causes. They did not learn the truth for 22 years. Whitey Bulger, who would later become one of Boston's most notorious crime bosses, was a subject of MKUltra experiments while serving time in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta during the 1950s. He later described being given LSD and other drugs hundreds of times over 18 months. In interviews before his death, Bulger claimed the experiments had haunted him for decades, causing nightmares and flashbacks that never fully stopped. Mary Ray, a Canadian woman who sought treatment for depression at the Allen Memorial Institute, endured months of Cameron's psychic driving treatment. When she finally left the hospital, she could not remember the previous 25 years of her life. She did not recognize her home. She had forgotten how to cook. She had lost all memory of her children growing up. Her husband essentially had to raise her like a child, teaching her everything over again. She never fully recovered her memories. Val Orlikow, another Canadian victim of Cameron's experiments, spent years after her treatment suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and confusion. She had entered the hospital as a functional person with manageable symptoms. She left unable to care for herself or her family. The treatment designed to help her had instead destroyed her life. These are just a few of the victims whose names we know. But the reality is that thousands of people were affected by MKUltra. Most of them never learned what happened to them. Many suffered in silence, confused about why they had mysterious psychological problems or terrifying flashbacks. Some took their own lives. Others lived with trauma they could never explain. And the perpetrators? The scientists who designed these experiments, the officials who approved them, the administrators who funded them. Most faced no consequences whatsoever. In fact, many retired with honors, their reputations intact, their secrets protected by classification. The victims got trauma. The perpetrators got pensions. This is the human cost of MKUltra. Not abstract policy debates or classified memos, but real people whose lives were shattered in pursuit of a goal that was never achieved. For 2 decades, MKUltra operated in almost complete secrecy. Hundreds of people knew about it within the intelligence community. Dozens of institutions participated. Thousands of individuals were affected. Yet the American public had no idea any of it was happening. That secrecy finally began to crack in the early 1970s. In 1973, Richard Helms became the first CIA director to be fired from his position. As he prepared to leave office, he made a decision that would haunt investigators for decades. He ordered the destruction of all MKUltra records. Every file, every memo, every experimental report, everything was to be burned. CIA employees carried out his orders systematically. They fed thousands of documents into incinerators. They shredded files. They destroyed evidence of one of the largest domestic intelligence operations in American history. But they made one crucial mistake. Due to an administrative error, approximately 20,000 pages of financial records had been filed incorrectly. These documents escaped destruction. 1 year later, in December 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published an explosive article in the New York Times. The article revealed that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic operations, including experiments on American citizens. The revelations shocked the nation and triggered congressional investigations. In 1975, Senator Frank Church led a special committee to investigate abuses by American intelligence agencies. The Church Committee, as it became known, uncovered shocking details about MKUltra and other illegal programs. Sidney Gottlieb was called to testify. Granted immunity from prosecution, he admitted to conducting experiments with LSD on unwitting subjects, but claimed he was just following orders and acting in the interest of national security. Other officials testified about the scope of the program. Details emerged about the prison experiments, the hospital tests, Operation Midnight Climax. The public learned that their government had been conducting Nazi-style experiments on American citizens for 20 years. The outrage was immediate and bipartisan, but there was a problem. With most of the documents destroyed, the full extent of MKUltra could never be known. Investigators could only work with the fragmentary financial records that survived and the testimony of officials who had every reason to minimize their involvement. Countless victims would never be identified. Entire experiments would never come to light. The destruction of evidence had worked exactly as Helms intended. Given the magnitude of what had been revealed, the American public expected accountability. Surely those responsible for such systematic human rights abuses would face criminal prosecution. Surely there would be trials, convictions, prison sentences. Surely justice would be served. But they were disappointed. No senior CIA official was ever criminally charged for their role in MKUltra. Sidney Gottlieb, the program's architect, never faced trial. He retired to his farm in Virginia where he raised goats and practiced folk dancing. Richard Helms, who had destroyed the evidence, received only a suspended sentence for lying to Congress about unrelated matters. The institution itself faced no meaningful consequences. In 1976, President Gerald Ford invited the family of Frank Olson to the White House. He officially apologized for the government's role in Olson's death and offered compensation. The family received $750,000, a sum they considered insulting given what had been done. It was hush money, not justice. Canadian victims of Dr. Cameron's experiments fared slightly better, but only after years of litigation. In 1988, the Canadian government agreed to compensate victims with payments of $100,000 each. But the settlement required victims to waive their right to sue the United States, effectively protecting the CIA from legal accountability. American victims had even less recourse. Many did not know they had been part of MKUltra until decades later, if they ever learned at all. Those who did know found it nearly impossible to prove their cases in court because the evidence had been destroyed. Lawyers argued for years about what the CIA owed these victims. Most received nothing. The official position of the United States government became that MKUltra was a regrettable mistake, a product of Cold War excess, something that could never happen again because of new oversight mechanisms. But this narrative required ignoring several uncomfortable facts. The program had operated for 2 decades under multiple presidential administrations. Hundreds of officials had been complicit, and when finally discovered, the government's first instinct was to destroy evidence rather than come clean. Justice, in any meaningful sense, was never achieved. The perpetrators lived comfortable lives. The victims struggled with trauma, and the institution that enabled it all continued operating with minimal reform. But the story of MKUltra does not end with its official termination or with justice denied. In fact, the most unexpected chapter of this saga involves an irony so profound that it would be unbelievable if it were not historically documented. The CIA's attempt to weaponize LSD for mind control accidentally helped create the 60s counterculture movement that challenged everything the agency stood for. Here's what happened. During the years of MKUltra, the CIA purchased enormous quantities of LSD. They distributed it to researchers at dozens of institutions. They tested it on thousands of people. And inevitably, given the scale of the operation, significant amounts of LSD escaped into the general population. Researchers shared it with colleagues outside official channels. Test subjects told friends about their experiences. And as knowledge of LSD spread through academic and medical communities, a growing number of people began experimenting with the drug recreationally and spiritually, rather than as a tool of intelligence. Timothy Leary, the Harvard psychologist whose early research was partially funded by CIA front organizations, became fascinated by LSD's potential for consciousness expansion. In 1963, he was fired from Harvard for his increasingly radical views on psychedelics. Rather than retreating from public view, he became one of the most prominent advocates for LSD use, coining the phrase "turn on, tune in, drop out." Throughout the mid to late 1960s, LSD became central to the hippie movement. Hundreds of thousands of young Americans experimented with the drug, not as subjects in mind control experiments, but as participants in a cultural revolution. They used LSD for mystical experiences, artistic inspiration, and philosophical exploration. The Grateful Dead built their entire aesthetic around psychedelic experience. Festivals like Woodstock celebrated consciousness expansion through drugs. And what were these young people doing with their expanded consciousness? They were protesting the Vietnam War. They were questioning authority. They were rejecting traditional values. They were challenging the very government and social order that the CIA existed to protect. The irony is almost poetic. The CIA thought LSD could be a weapon for control. Instead, it became a tool for liberation. They thought it would help them manipulate minds. Instead, helped inspire a generation to think independently. They wanted to strengthen American power. Instead, they accidentally fueled a movement that questioned whether that power should exist at all. Of course, the story is more complex than simple cause and effect. The 60s counterculture had many sources beyond LSD, but there's no denying that the CIA's massive investment in distributing and studying this drug played a role in making it available and culturally significant. The monster the CIA created was not the one they intended. They wanted a compliant population vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Instead, they helped create a generation that rejected manipulation entirely. They wanted control. They got rebellion. And they never saw it coming. Today, more than 50 years after MKUltra officially ended, we are still grappling with its legacy. The program fundamentally changed how America regulates human experimentation. In response to MKUltra and other abuses, Congress passed new laws requiring informed consent, institutional review boards, and ethical oversight for any research involving human subjects. These protections matter and have prevented countless abuses, but the deeper legacy is about trust. MKUltra taught a generation of Americans that their government was capable of systematic human rights violations in the name of national security. That lesson has never been forgotten. Every conspiracy theory about government experiments, every piece of anti-institutional rhetoric, every expression of distrust toward intelligence agencies can trace part of its lineage back to the fact that MKUltra really happened, and we still don't know the full story. Richard Helms destroyed most of the evidence. The 20,000 pages that survived give us glimpses, but countless experiments, victims, and outcomes remain unknown. How many people were affected? What were all the sub-projects? What other drugs and techniques did they test? Who else was involved? These questions will never be fully answered. Perhaps the most troubling question is whether we have truly learned anything. The CIA argues that MKUltra was an aberration, impossible to repeat given modern oversight. But the fundamental dynamic that created it, the belief that national security justifies almost anything, that dynamic still exists. The true monster was never LSD. It was not the drugs or the techniques, or even the specific experiments. The monster was and is the human capacity to justify evil in service of a perceived greater good. It was the arrogance of believing that the ends justify any means. It was the institutional structure that allowed hundreds of people to participate in atrocities while convincing themselves they were patriots. That monster still exists, and it is always looking for new forms to inhabit. The lesson of MKUltra is simple. Power without accountability inevitably leads to abuse. We must remain vigilant. We must demand transparency. And we must never again allow national security to become an excuse for inhumanity. Because the moment we forget what happened, the moment we decide that this time is different or these circumstances are exceptional, that's when the monster returns. And by then it is always too late.